Welcome to the debate. Today we are bringing a really fascinating historical case study before a panel of modern investors. We are looking back at the dawn of the 20th century, specifically that window between 1901 and 1905, to analyze one of history's most spectacular collapsed ventures, and that is Nikola Tesla's Wardenclyffe project. This was a moment when an undisputed genius attempted to build a facility on Long Island that would literally change the course of human history, only to see it end in financial ruin and the physical demolition of his dreams.
Yeah, and the central question we are putting before this panel today is absolutely crucial for anyone evaluating ambitious, world-changing technology or, hardware startups. Was the collapse of the Wardenclyffe Tower primarily a failure of capital and market readiness? Or was it a fundamental failure of engineering and technical overreach? We really want to look closely at the data to uncover why a mine that successfully architected the alternating current revolution stumbled so dramatically when it came time to execute this specific vision.
Exactly. And to make sure our analysis is rigorous, this debate is strictly grounded in historical records. We'll be drawing extensively from Tesla's own autobiography, My Inventions, alongside detailed historical accounts, architectural data preserved by the Tesla Science Center at Wardenclyffe, and his extensive patent records from that era.
Right. And for the purposes of our analysis today, I'll be adopting the perspective of the engineer. I am going to argue that the collapse of Wardenclyffe was fundamentally a technical failure. It was driven by unchecked scope creep and the sheer physical limitations of trying to scale up unproven technology without any intermediate steps.
And I'll be taking the role of the historian. My position is that Wardenclyffe collapsed due to a socioeconomic mismatch. It was a grand, visionary project that simply exceeded its patrons' patience and the market's readiness.
Let's just jump right into the core of these positions. From an engineering standpoint, the financial starvation of Wardenclyffe that you're going to point to was really just a symptom of profound technical overreach. I mean, think about what Tesla was actually pitching.
Right.
He secured his initial funding to build a global communication system. But what he started building was a 187-foot wooden tower topped with a massive 68-foot spherical terminal, a structure he called the magnifying transmitter. The fatal error here was that Tesla attempted to combine two entirely different engineering goals into a single, completely unproven piece of infrastructure: a global wireless communication system and a global wireless power transmitter.
Well, I think that's a very specific and somewhat uncharitable reading of the timeline and his intentions.
I'd argue it's the only reading that aligns with the physics of what he was physically building on Long Island. He was trying to jump from his starting point in previous experiments, which was around 200 to 300 kilowatts, to a system meant to harness the Earth's natural energy for what he described as several thousand horsepower. And he wanted to do this entirely without an intermediate scaling phase. As any investor in hardware knows, you cannot skip the prototyping phase on a global scale. Tesla himself admitted in his post-mortem writings that the project was retarded by laws of nature. The system was designed to excite the entire globe, but the atmospheric and terrestrial resistance was far greater than he anticipated. It was a fatal technical error.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the root cause of the failure. Wardenclyffe's collapse was fundamentally financial and market-driven, not a proven technical impossibility. The project simply exceeded the resources and the timeline of early 20th century capital. If we look at the historical record, J. Piermont Morgan, his primary backer, actually fulfilled his initial generous promise of $150,000 to the letter.
He did, yes.
Tesla himself wrote that it would be unreasonable to expect more from him. But the sheer scale of the vision, a global telecommunications infrastructure combined with worldwide wireless power, frightened off conventional follow-on capital.
Frighten them off, or did they just realize the milestones weren't being met?
They were frightened by the horizon time. The project was doomed by its timeline relative to the evolution of modern capitalism. As Tesla noted later, the world was not prepared for it, and the project was too far ahead of time. The tower wasn't dismantled because the physics were disproven in a definitive test. It was ultimately demolished for scrap in 1917 strictly to satisfy Tesla's mounting financial debts at the Waldorf Astoria. This proves the venture died of financial starvation.
It was a victim of a socioeconomic environment that couldn't monetize or sustain a project of such unprecedented scope.
Well, let's unpack that scope, because this brings us to our first major point of contention, the role of JP Morgan and the realities of what modern venture capital calls scope creep. You mentioned Morgan fulfilled his initial promise. That's true. But Tesla initially pitched Morgan on a communication system to compete with Marconi's transatlantic telegraph. That was the minimum viable product, the MVP. But once he got the money, Tesla secretly pivoted to a power transmission system. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I don't buy the narrative that the capital dried up simply because the vision was too grand. The capital dried up because the engineering deliverables for the original communications pitch were completely sidelined by this pursuit of global power transmission.
I hear that, but we have to look at the business model he was actually proposing. If you read Tesla's own 12-point outline for his world system, which he formulated in 1900, his vision was incredibly sound in theory. It promised the interconnection of existing telegraph exchanges all over the world. It promised a secret and non-interferable government telegraph service. It promised the interconnection of all stock tickers, the universal distribution of general news, and a universal marine service allowing navigators to steer perfectly without a compass. To our panel of investors today, this sounds exactly like a pitch for the modern internet and GPS combined.
I don't disagree that the 12-point plan sounds beautifully prophetic. It's a brilliant piece of futurism. But as an investor, you don't just invest in the prospectus, you invest in the mechanism the founder uses to achieve it.
The mechanism was the magnifying transmitter. And my point is that Morgan didn't pull out because the engineering of that transmitter was demonstrably failing. Morgan pulled out because the business model of transmitting free power globally didn't align with early 20th century capitalism. How do you put a meter on energy that is being pulled out of the ground by anyone with a tuned receiver? You can't. Tesla's vision threatened the very energy monopolies that men like Morgan were actively building with General Electric and the Edison system.
I come at it from a completely different angle. You're suggesting Morgan withdrew out of a monopolistic fear of unmetered power. But let's look at the actual engineering pivot Tesla made. To achieve this dual communication and power system, Tesla believed he could use the Earth as a perfect natural conductor. He wanted to create what he called terrestrial stationary waves. To put that in terms our panel might appreciate, he was effectively treating the entire globe like a giant tuning fork, trying to make the whole planet resonate. To do this, he wasn't just sending a signal. He was trying to excite the Earth as a massive resonant transformer. That is an immense, unproven technical pivot from simply sending a wireless telegraph signal across the Atlantic.
It was a massive pivot, sure, but it was a pivot grounded in successful empirical research. He didn't just dream this up out of thin air.
But was it actually grounded in scalable research?
Absolutely, and this brings us to the crucial precedent of his work in Colorado Springs. In 1899, Tesla spent over a year in Colorado, specifically to test these exact theories before he ever broke ground on Wardenclyffe. The laboratory records from that period are incredibly clear. He successfully generated 100 million volts with a conical coil. He proved that high-frequency signals could be transmitted without wires. He produced electrical sparks over 100 feet long.
Yeah.
He even noted in his logs that he could distinctly hear thunderclaps at a distance of 550 miles using his equipment, which proved to him the conductivity of the Earth and atmosphere. He had already solved the underlying physics. Building on Long Island was just a matter of infrastructure, and infrastructure at that scale requires patient capital.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the reality of scaling? Colorado Springs was a success in its specific context, yes, but scientifically speaking, you can't just take a high-altitude experiment and drop it at sea level on Long Island and expect the exact same physics to apply. Every engineer knows that what works in a highly controlled, specific environment doesn't automatically scale to global commercial infrastructure. Observing a phenomenon in the thin, dry, highly conductive air of Colorado is vastly different from building a commercial world system on the damp, dense, sea-level coast of New York.
The environmental differences were a hurdle, certainly. Any transition from a lab to a production facility has environmental hurdles, but they weren't an insurmountable physical barrier.
They were an insurmountable barrier when combined with his absolute refusal to scale incrementally. Look at his own technical specifications for Wardenclyffe. He claimed that theoretically, a terminal of less than 90 feet in diameter was sufficient to develop the immense electromotive force required. And he claimed that for antenna currents of 2,000 to 4,000 amperes, it need not be larger than 30 feet in diameter. To put 4,000 amperes into perspective for our listeners, that is enough current to vaporize standard commercial wiring of that era in seconds.
Wow.
It's essentially trying to channel a sustained lightning bolt through 191 materials. He was pushing the theoretical limits of material science and impedance matching, getting the power source and the load to perfectly align so energy isn't lost far beyond what was possible. The technical leap from a wooden lab in Colorado to 170-foot tower, meant to handle thousands of horsepower, completely ignored the fundamental engineering limits of his time. He lacked the feedback loops to intermediate Series A and Series B testing phases to achieve resonance on a planetary scale.
I understand the skepticism around the scaling, but we have to remember that Tesla's methodology was fundamentally different from the trial-and-error approach of his contemporaries, like Thomas Edison. Edison would try 10,000 materials for a light bulb filament until one worked. Tesla wrote extensively about his process of visualizing inventions. He would build an apparatus in his imagination, run it, test it for imbalances, look for wear and tear, and perfect it before ever touching a physical tool. He stated that in 20 years there had not been a single exception to this method working. Engineering, as he put it, is positive in results. He didn't need the incremental Series A testing because he did it mentally.
But the universe doesn't always conform to the blueprints in our minds, no matter how brilliant the mind. Hardware is hard, and we don't have to guess if the universe pushed back against Tesla's mental model. He explicitly tells us it did. If we interpret Tesla's own post-mortem of the Wardenclyffe project, we find a very revealing admission. In his autobiography, he explicitly states that his project was, and I quote, retarded by laws of nature.
Wait, if we are presenting this to our panel of investors, context is everything. You are focusing heavily on a 5-word phrase out of a much broader philosophical reflection on why the project stopped.
I focus on it because it's the critical engineering confession. As an engineer, Tesla eventually had to look at the data and recognize that the atmospheric and terrestrial resistance to his magnifying transmitter was simply greater than his initial Colorado Springs data suggested. He was trying to pump enormous amounts of energy into the Earth, expecting it to ring like a bell without any energy fading away. The laws of nature he refers to are the laws of thermodynamics, the capacitive loss of the Earth, and most importantly, the inverse square law of radiation.
Could you clarify how you're applying the inverse square law here?
Think of it like a flashlight beam. If you shine a flashlight against a wall from 1 foot away, the light is intensely bright and focused. If you back up to 10 feet away, the light has spread out over a much larger area, and it's significantly dimmer. The energy dissipates rapidly as it expands outward. Tesla was essentially trying to shine an electromagnetic flashlight across the entire globe, hoping it would be just as bright on the other side. The energy dissipated into the Earth. The system could not achieve the required resonance efficiently enough to be viable as a power grid. That is a technical failure based on the laws of physics.
Let's look at that exact quote again, because I interpret it entirely differently. Tesla didn't say the laws of physics made the project impossible. Let me read the full context of that quote for the panel. He wrote, "My project was retarded by laws of nature. The world was not prepared for it. It was too far ahead of time, but the same laws will prevail in the end and make it a triumphal success."
He's still acknowledging an insurmountable barrier at the time he was building it.
Yes, but I argue that Tesla viewed the socioeconomic environment as a law of nature. He firmly believed in a mechanistic theory of human life. He literally wrote that human beings are automatons, driven by the forces of our environment. When he says the world was not prepared for it, he is diagnosing a societal failure, a market failure. He explicitly stated that the world system will ultimately be a triumphal success in the future. That means the physics were sound in his mind. But human society and the limitations of its financial and competitive systems were the actual limiting factors. It was capital that ran out of runway and failed the genius,
not the genius that failed the physics.
I think that's a highly romanticized view of a project that was bleeding cash and completely failing to produce a commercial prototype. Tesla was an inventor who routinely promised investors the moon to keep the capital flowing. Let's look at his track record during that exact same period to understand his mindset. He proposed building a massive ring around the equator that would float freely to allow rapid global travel. He proposed conveying letters across the sea through submarine tubes in spherical containers. He even proposed deriving power from the diurnal rotation of the Earth itself. These are the hallmarks of a brilliant, unfettered imagination, absolutely. But they are also the hallmarks of an engineer who has lost his tether to practical, incremental deliverables. Wardenclyffe was the ultimate manifestation of this. He promised Morgan a transatlantic wireless telegraph to compete with Marconi, but he took the money and built a monument to a theoretical global power grid that he ultimately couldn't switch on.
You bring up Marconi, which perfectly highlights the market dynamics at play. Marconi succeeded commercially because he offered a single, highly focused, easily monetizable service: simple wireless telegraphy. And it's worth noting he utilized the very patents and theoretical groundwork Tesla established, as the Supreme Court later verified. Marconi basically built a stripped-down MVP of Tesla's tech, but Tesla was trying to install the entire 21st century telecommunications infrastructure in 1902. He was attempting to leapfrog the telegraph entirely and go straight to global voice, image, and power transmission.
Exactly. He skipped the necessary steps to prove product-market fit.
But failing to achieve product-market fit doesn't mean the product itself defies physics. It is a failure to sequence his deliverables for his investors. It is not proof that the magnifying transmitter, if fully funded and given the proper runway to be refined over several years, wouldn't have functioned. We must remember that Tesla had already revolutionized the world with alternating current. He had proven his detractors wrong when they said polyphase motors were impossible. He had successfully harnessed Niagara Falls when the world thought it was a pipe dream. He had earned the right to swing for the fences, but the capital markets of the time were too short-sighted, too focused on quarterly returns, to sustain a project with a decades-long horizon.
I just don't buy that the physics of global wireless power would have worked if he just had an infinite bank account. Even with today's technology, 120 years later, the idea of transmitting industrial levels of power wirelessly through the Earth and atmosphere with high efficiency and without catastrophic environmental effects remains largely impractical. You can't bribe the inverse square law with patient capital. As an engineer, you have to operate within the constraints of the physical universe as it exists, not as you visualize it in your mind. Tesla's magnifying transmitter was designed to eliminate distance entirely, claiming there would be no diminution in the intensity of the transmitted impulses. That is a direct challenge to the fundamental laws of energy propagation.
But he believed that by using the Earth as a resonant circuit, he wasn't radiating energy outward into space, which is where your flashlight analogy and the inverse square law applies. He believed he was reflecting it within the Earth's closed system. He stated that, in the narrowest significance of the term, his system was a resonant transformer proportioned to fit the globe and its electrical constants. He wasn't ignoring physics. He was applying a different set of physical principles based on resonance.
And I maintain that calculating the electrical constants of the entire globe from a wooden laboratory in Colorado and then staking a massive commercial venture on the assumption that you can perfectly resonate the planet without massive energy loss is the definition of engineering hubris. It is the ultimate cautionary tale for hardware startups.
Well, as we draw our discussion to a close, I think it's vital for our panel of investors to synthesize these perspectives because they offer two very different lessons. To summarize my position as the historian, the Wardenclyffe project serves as a profound cautionary tale about the dangers of funding a project that is too far ahead of societal and market readiness. Tesla's underlying scientific theory was incredibly visionary. His 12-point plan for the world system essentially outlined the architecture of the modern internet, GPS, and global wireless communications decades before computers existed. But a grand vision that frightens off conventional capital and an infrastructure project that demands more patience than the market can bear will ultimately starve. Wardenclyffe was demolished to pay debts at a hotel. It was a tragic victim of an unready world and an inflexible financial system.
And to summarize the perspective of the engineer,
Wardenclyffe demonstrates the absolute peril of ignoring incremental engineering and prototyping. Vision is essential, but combining a global communications network and a global power grid into a single, unproven 187-foot tower without intermediate scaling was a fatal technical overextension. Tesla allowed his ultimate vision, the scope creep of free global power, to completely derail the practical, deliverable milestones that his investors expected. The laws of nature, particularly concerning energy dissipation and global resonance, presented physical barriers that no amount of runway or capital could simply wave away. You have to prove the physics before you scale the infrastructure.
Yet, despite our substantive disagreement on the primary cause of its collapse, I think we both find significant areas of convergence here. We both agree that Tesla's underlying concepts for a worldwide wireless information network were astonishingly prophetic.
Undoubtedly. When you read his descriptions of a cheap receiver, no bigger than a watch, that would allow someone on land or sea to listen to a speech or hear music delivered from anywhere in the world, it is impossible not to see the modern smartphone. The conceptual brilliance of his world system is a profound testament to his genius, even if the physical execution of the Wardenclyffe Tower itself was fundamentally flawed.
It truly is. For the panel of modern investors listening today, the story of Nikola Tesla and Wardenclyffe is a masterclass in the delicate balance between visionary capital and engineering reality. It challenges us to ask whether we are funding the next phase of human evolution with the patience it requires, or simply building a beautiful tower that will eventually be sold for scrap because we skipped the MVP. There is far more to explore in Tesla's patents, his writings, and the historical records at the Tesla Science Center to fully grasp this complex narrative.
The tension between the ideal design in a founder's mind and the physical execution in the real world is eternal. Understanding Wardenclyffe requires us to look unflinchingly through both the socioeconomic and the technical lens. You can't separate the business model from the physics.
Precisely. We leave it to you, our listeners, to weigh the historical evidence for yourselves and draw your own conclusions about the true nature of this magnificent failure. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.